We are proceeding to our next panel, and I am going to pass the baton to our moderator, Ray Finch. Ray.
Great. I thought I would begin with one sentence from a recent article because you'll understand. The U.S. and Europe's rupture with Russia has entered its third year. Trust is non-existent. As one looks into the future, one sees uncertainties. What is the way forward? Is there a way forward? I can't think of two better people to answer that question than people on my right, Mr. Tom Wilhelm and Dr. Maria Amelicheva. Tom Wilhelm is the epitome of the soldier diplomat, and I would call Dr. Amelicheva the global academic. I was going to say Russian academic, but I think global academic is better. So in the interest of time, Tom, do you want to give your comments? Oh, no, Maria.
Okay, thank you.
Lady.
Okay, I have a short PowerPoint presentation for you as well. Okay, so in the 19th century, a very famous Russian poet, Fyodor Tyutchev, wrote, "Умом Россию не понять," which means you can't really understand Russia using your reason, using your own concepts, your ways of thinking. Well, despite this admonition, Western and non-Western analysts have been trying to understand Russian foreign policy and Russian foreign politics and Russian international relations. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to try to put a variety of explanations on why Russia does what it has been doing into two broad categories. One, a group of explanations usually occurs on the guise of political realism, and this is the dominant perspective on Russian foreign policy. So, realists of all genres portrays international politics as an incessant struggle for power, where victory is determined by whoever has greatest capabilities, right? So in this sort of framework, Russia and its behavior is understood as consistent with sort of a status quo satisfied state who only seeks to preserve its position in the international system by maintaining the balance of power. This balance of power has been threatened by the United States, especially by the United States' push for NATO's enlargement. And so if I'm going to be using a lot of examples from Russia's relations with Ukraine, in particular Russia's annexation of Crimea, to illustrate these points. So from this standpoint, Russia's decision to annex Crimea stemmed from its desire to contain and balance the United States. And by the way, this is not the only realist explanation of Russia's foreign policy. Another strand of realism, known as offensive realism, calls Russia a revisionist power. We've also heard this term, revisionist power. So as a revisionist power, Russia harbors aggressive intentions and pursues the goal of power aggrandizement. So according to this perspective, Russia's decision to invade Crimea was rational and expected because it allowed the Kremlin to acquire the strategic control over a vital military security asset, Sevastopol. Okay, so again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over all of the realist explanations of what Russia has been doing internationally. Another group of explanations sort of portrays Russia as a neo-imperial state. So it has been cast as an inherently expansionist empire, which imperialist ideology has habitually colored its foreign policy towards its neighbors. So if realist explanations emphasize Moscow's rational egoism, the imperialist and neo-imperialist interpretations link Russian foreign policy to ideological motivations, which are informed by Moscow's age-old imperial identity. Okay? So I am myself guilty of both types of explanations, but I am going to take kind of a dissident, unorthodox position here and try to apply critical geopolitics thinking on Russian foreign policy. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to be very, very, forgive me, shallow, very, 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 very short about what critical geopolitics is about. Essentially, it argues that there are multiple truths about international politics. Even though there are facts, the way we understand, interpret them varies from context to context. So critical geopolitics is about how states design, live, and defend very distinctive geopolitical visions about international relations, the so-called truth. Okay, and these truths have enormous influence on how states behave internationally. So my argument is that we can considerably enhance our understanding of the Kremlin's foreign policy if we try to look at what Russia does internationally through the lens of its own beliefs rather than operating via some preconceived notions or, deductively designed concepts and theories about foreign policy and international relations. So in the remainder of my presentation, I am going to present you with the narrative that I derived from the discourse analysis of the statements, speeches, doctrinal documents published in Russia in recent years. Okay? So what are those Russia's truths? The first one is familiar to all of us, is that Russia has always been, and will always remain a great power by virtue of its size, intermediate position between the West and the East, immense natural resources, historical legacy, and cultural dominance. I would like to emphasize, though, that what makes a great power is not a constant. And in the case of Russia, what makes Russia a great power has changed depending on changing domestic and international circumstances. In 2000s, in early 2000s, Russia has played with notion of like energy superpower state, and some other contents were imbued in the notion of great power state. But one of the striking differences of the understanding of great power state now is that it includes the notion of cultural dominance. So as a presidential candidate, Vladimir Putin wrote an article for Nezavisимая Gazeta in which he asserted that Russia's civilizational identity is based on preservation of Russian cultural dominance, which is not only carried by ethnic Russians, but all carriers of this identity, regardless of the nationality. Okay, and I'll talk about this cultural aspect of Russia's civilizational identity a little bit more. Okay, so the next truth is that Russia finds itself in the world that undergoes a serious systemic crisis unleashed by the United States, its unilateral foreign policy, its hegemony of international political space and ideological space. So the world is undergoing turbulence, okay? So international relations are undergoing a turbulent transition to a polycentric world order. And this is also a very important change because for a decade and a half, Russian policymakers used the notion of multipolar. Now references to the multipolar world order have been replaced by references to polycentric world order. The differences are still to be worked out, but in some of the statements and speeches, Lavrov and Putin refer to polycentric world order as the one where civilizations, but not states, constitute the core actors, if you wish. So civilizations are defined by history, culture, language, and they are envisioned as the new geobodies constituting the basic units in the polycentric world order. And Russia perceives itself as sort of the pinnacle of the so-called Russian world, and it's also a crusader for the Russian civilization. And this in and of itself also bestows a great power status on the Russian Federation. Okay, so Ruski Mir, Russian world, we heard about this. So a notion that was kind of introduced by Putin back in 2006 and has been popularized recently by mass media, by the politicians, by the academics there. The boundaries of the Ruski Mir, or Russian world, are not static. They are creatively defined and redefined. The most important thing is that the territories that bear the mark of the Russian culture, Russian cultural tradition, historical legacy, they are all included into this civilizational identity known as the Russian world. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to link those truths to some of the foreign policy choices of the Kremlin. Okay, so for Russia, culture is a foundational element of the Russian civilizational identity. And therefore, the goal of cultural preservation is one of the highest priorities of the Kremlin foreign policy. Because culture is so paramount for Russia's identity, the threats are also understood broadly. It's not only threats to Russia's territory, so they're no longer limited to traditional concerns with the military occupation of Russia. Any imposition of Western values alien to the traditions and ways of life in the Russian world has been perceived as imminently dangerous to Russia. And states within Russia are expected to use threats, coercion, and even armed force to protect and preserve their civilization, even if doing so, and this is very important, even if doing so is self-defeating or irrelevant from rational security and capability optimization perspective, so rational perspective, rational realist perspective, okay? So if I were to apply it to Russia's annexation of Crimea and Russia's actions in Ukraine, in Putin's opinion, in Ukraine, the West carried out a premeditated offensive on Russia's historic mission of integrating the Russian world, which is used interchangeably with Eurasian space. That, in turn, necessitated and legitimated Russia's invasion in Ukraine. So this decision to annex Crimea was rational from the Russian standpoint, but that rationality had its own internal logic rooted in Russia's strategic calculus that is deeply intertwined with Russia's value commitments and the tradition of doing things in certain ways. The Russian government appears to believe that Russia is engaged in a civilizational as well as geopolitical struggle with the West. The struggle is no longer about territorial space and resources, but includes the war of ideas and values, the dispute of minds. The victory in this war is paramount and inevitable for Russia, if Russia is to preserve its national identity and preeminence in international affairs. So in Ukraine, again, Russia sees itself as a heroic nation on a mission, safeguarding the Russian world and restoring fairness in international relations, long abused by the West. Standing up for fairness and truth has been deeply embedded in Russia's honor code, according to Vladimir Putin. And kind of to conclude, although the discussed conceptual architecture and global geoimagery only exist in the minds of the Kremlin ideologues and Russian top foreign policy makers, it represents the geopolitical construct with which the rest of the world will have to deal with so long as Vladimir Putin and his team remains in power. Again, we can dismiss it, we can trivialize it, we can laugh at it, we can deride it, but this is the imagery, these are the truths that inform how the top foreign policymakers in Russia perceive international relations around them. And it is this geopolitical that provides a strategic rationale and ideological persuasion for Moscow's projection of soft and hard power in the neighborhood and further abroad. So this is the kinds of thinking that motivates Russian foreign policy actions in the neighborhood and beyond, and it will continue to do so as long as the current administration remains in power. Okay, thank you.
The first thing I do, and I want to take 1 minute to do this, is to thank you, Vitaly and Bart, for once again hosting this event. The Foreign Military Studies Office, really does appreciate the relationship. Maria, it's good to see everybody here. The other thing is I'd only add one thing to my bio for everybody, and that's that I'm a CREES graduate, from 1988. It's good to see my old professors here. They can grade this afterwards. The purpose and the subject of my talk is to provide a perspective of how I think, or we think, Russian military officers would view themselves looking at the issue of our subject today, being on NATO's flank. Okay, and the Foreign Military Studies Office tries to do that, to try to understand the foreign perspective and everything. And in doing that, the value of the talk today is there's a lot of punditry, there's a lot of articles being written on the face of conflict such as it is right now, especially in Europe and regarding NATO and Russia. And there's lots of terms being used: hybrid warfare, Russian new generation warfare, things like that. And so there's this need to return to frankly, some basics in understanding the Russian perspective of military science, really. Okay, and in that regard, I'm just really going to go over this, and it could not have fitted more neatly with Maria's lead-off lecture here, because you'll see where there is some overlap, certainly from the geopolitical perspective that she reflected in how they view their foreign and really security policy and position, and then the sort of normative behavior we're going to talk about from the military community inside of Russia's military establishment. Okay, and so the overlap will be great, but the outcome will be the same, but our path will go different. They had me come here because I'm an old retired Army colonel, so I will use another minute of my time to tell a war story. It may be the most interesting part of my talk. That's why I do this, by the way. So, I did have a long time ago, when I was a much younger man, this great, unique opportunity and quite frankly privilege to actually serve in a Russian military brigade. So I've done that, and as I did that, I spent the first month with them, frankly, a little disarmed, because everything seemed about the same as having been in a U.S. military infantry unit. So I remember I went up to my counterpart, Alexei Solovyov, said, "Hey, Colonel Solovyov, I'll tell you that this is interesting. I've been here a month, and it seems like there's not much difference between Americans, an officer, and a Russian officer." And he looked and he thought. He says, "No, there are many, many similarities, Tom." He goes, "But in your Army, you'll be promoted because you take initiative. In our Army, no good initiative goes unpunished." And so it is funny, but it sort of set the tone. So I started looking for those things that are the same yet different. Okay, and again, I use that to start this off, because some of these, you'll nod your head and you can see understanding, and then some of these you have to understand the underlying divergent nature, and that's the object of this very short discussion I'm going to have. The first is to review and lead from what Maria was talking about. That it starts from the idea that they observe, and a lot of this is Putin regime stuff, I have to say, but I'll say Russians and Putin regime, and sometimes they're the same, sometimes there's a little different, but that they do have strategic objectives, and you can look in their documents, and you can also look, like you can for us or anybody, vis-a-vis their actions. And what we see is that, I put this up front, is that, this is the one they don't really write about, is that there's a regime maintenance component to their strategic policies and strategic choices that they make. Okay, and we've seen that, fascinatingly, dramatically in the last week with the establishment of the National Guard, as Dr. Kipp would point out, not so different than before, but it's an interesting move toward the notion of having to preserve a center of power within the Russian, not only society, but I'm arguing for security establishment. Okay, Russia doesn't like, go back to my initiative story, too many ideas to spoil the plan. Okay, so regime maintenance becomes a major part of that. Part of this, and I argue, is creating an outside threat. Again, if you look at having a regime that's going to take care of you, it's not just the country, it's not just the esoteric polity of Russia, it's leaders with their hand on the helm. So regime maintenance through establishment, they call them forms and methods, of creating forces and dynamics internal to the country, and we saw that with this National Guard change, is part of that thinking, and an outside threat. We had a great lecture from Adrian earlier that talked about, that mentioned parts about the dire straits of the Russian economy going forward, given certain population decline in their most productive categories. So when you look at that, their goal to strengthen the economy is challenged from the outset. I mean, with fundamental architectural flaws and how they're going to go about doing that, in addition to being slave to a mostly hydrocarbon influx for cash. So in doing this, what are the things that the security establishment can add to this that would be talked about in the Security Council and things like that? Well, one of them is sort of your how to get in and around sanctions, counter sanctioning position of your policies so that you're sanction proof, if you will, or at least sanction reduced if you're going to behave in a way that's going to incur that. You got to counter the effects of those hydrocarbon dollars and protect them in your military development planning and budget. I mean, so the VPK has to be part of your calculation when you do that. And then finally, you just create more trading partners and more trading paradigms. So, although it was interesting about the gas, in Europe and some of the alternatives we heard from Ukraine getting around and being able to get off the Russian gas pipeline. I think there are studies out there that show that some of that's the same gas just coming back from different channels, and or can you really do that reliably if other parts of the gas chain for Europe are cut? So if you're in the Russian security establishment, you're understanding how leverage like that, electrical grids, there's water, there's a variety of other resources, are leverages you can bring from the security sphere into your trading relationships. The next, of course, is to establish security, and we're going to talk about that in a little more depth, through their practice of military science. And they're very consistent about it, and we know about it. What's I find interesting is we have this sort of emotive approach to our U.S. Military art right now as we pander to kind of the word choices of the day to develop and then execute military policies. But the Russians are pretty consistent about it. And the next is, of course, to dominate your near abroad. I mean, it has been a stated policy from the beginning in the time, from 1991 forward, that Russia's security is linked to how it feels about its near abroad. And you can follow all the conflicts in the region from their perspective going forward as mechanisms to stabilize and bring that near abroad under their influence, at least from a security standpoint. I think it's more broadly than that, but at least from a security standpoint, Russia must control its near abroad to feel secure. And then, of course, and Maria covered this really well, this idea about great power status. I think I said establish great power status. I'll change it to maintain great power status. But the idea here is it's the security sphere's mandate to make that happen. If you don't have great power status, you better go get it. If you got it, you better keep it. Okay, and that's done by the multipolar alternatives to the U.S. hegemony. Weakening and abolish NATO is centered to that, or neutralizing it. Protecting ethnic Russians, forming an ethnic Russian diaspora, or whatever you want to call it, community around the world, and then being able to consolidate it and gain some measure of allegiance and support will be part of your security thinking. And then finally, to consolidate historical lessons learned. So how do they do this? Okay. They do this through Russian military thinking, through these processes we understand really well. They do it through something they call foresight or forecasting. They have a very consistent office of, not necessarily net assessment, office of forecasting in the general staff. And from there, unlike ours, where we rotate, both leadership of departments and directorates in our own Department of Defense, these are consistent military thinkers who have been there for very long periods of time and studied things over time. And in there, in particular, one second. Yeah, I just want to cover this real quick. Yeah, they look at what's pertinent to us nowadays is that they look at war as something that's perpetual, that's ongoing. Marie brought that out, that their response in Crimea wasn't something they did. It was a response to they were responding to something that happened to them from their perspective. Okay, that war is perpetual, and they're involved in it now, and it's ongoing. The other part is that they have to win when they have a hard conflict and a shooting match. They have to win in that opening phase. Okay, they don't want to see war. They see war as perpetual, but they see the use of the military as something that has to win the phase it's put in. And doing that, inherent in that, are the centers of gravity of Russian ethnic Russians, which is your goal strategically, and then operationally doing that through information operations. That's sort of what all the latest writings are showing us. Then they practice this thing called forms and methods, and forms are organizations of substance and modes of combat actions. That's what we mean by this. And so that's goal-oriented developments, both organizationally, spatially, and also, it describes troop actions, okay? And methods has to do with sequencing and technique of employing forces and means to fulfill tasks in an operation. Sounds kind of complicated, but it's a practice that they use, and they're very consistent about it. And you find that in their writings all the time, whereas you don't find the words hybrid, you don't find the words Russian new generation warfare. I mean, you almost never find those, but you'll see forms and methods. So they stick to this scientific practice of this, and then they put it together in correlation of forces and means. Okay, and long algorithmic, books and pages of algorithmic studies of factors that go into these forms and methods to support what the forecasting is trying to get to. Okay, and it's this very scientific, very architecturally designed way of practicing military science. Okay, as opposed to really, the implementation is art, but they're real scientists about this. And the final category is military history, both Russian and non-Russian. And all the lessons that they're done, and we're going to get to this next thing, new generation warfare, come from the catalog of lessons they learned watching not only from their own conflicts in Afghanistan, Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea, Eastern Ukraine, but from watching us in Iraq and Afghanistan in particular. And some of the things that they've learned from this historical analysis that go into the process I mentioned, are that you need a projectable force, okay, versus an expeditionary force. Okay, expeditionary is Afghanistan with all its bad lessons. Projectable, Syria looks projectable. Projectable may look like vacationing soldiers in eastern Ukraine. I mean, so projectable, they've learned both from their mistakes, if you will, but also from watching us. The next is there is a mix of contract soldiers and professional soldiers. And where do you find contract soldiers? Well, they're driving trucks. They're doing the stuff that release the professional soldiers to do more of the tasks that you count on them to do. They've done some organizational changes. This goes back to the forms and methods, right? And so they pull out the Russian Special Forces from the GRU because they want it to be a more direct action organization. Okay, the informatization, we call it, of war is a big piece of this, and developing this, I think, with more synchronization in something called the National Defense Control Center. So these are some methods that they've watching how we fought a war with, combined operations in theaters, as well as their own experiences, and they've combined them, and we see them doing it. And it's led to this thing that was called, it was 2013, I think, new, and then there's an argument over whether Bogdanov said new, did he mean next, turn of warfare that's happening for this generation. So he got the name New Generation Warfare because they wrote it. We put, someone put an R in front of it. It's Russian New Generation Warfare. And what's fascinating is he says, there it is. There's this box. It was written. There it is. Here's the translation. And yet almost no one, goes back and pays. And it's really, for Russian writing, it's pretty easy to follow. It could be more complicated, but it's really there. And so they practice this. They note about the nature of warfare in general, that this is the characteristic of how it goes. What's fascinating by the Russian model is you can plug in any conflict that's ongoing or has recently happened, and you can follow phases, and that includes things Russians may have done or things we may have done. Okay, so this idea of new generation warfare, according to the Russian General Staff, leads us to some interesting dynamics. Okay, one is again the Russian perspective of threat, and this ties right back to Maria, and I'll sort of end here, is that over time, and this is just the NATO view, and the map's not perfect, it was designed for a more simple thing, but you see the march of NATO, or West, or just even forces outside Russia, non-Russian forces, closing in. And so there are countries that were NATO members, there are countries that were partner members, there were countries that were in partner actionship plans for NATO. Then there were countries in which there was regime change promoted by, sponsored to, or blessed, or at least appreciated by Western governments, happening all around them. So this idea that's the perpetual war that they were talking about, that they are responding to in their actions. Okay, and in order to do that, I'm going to go back the slide. Is you follow these things in a sort of sequential way. All right, you pressure the enemy, all right, politically, economically, and psychologically. Then you disorient them, okay, with propaganda, with information operations, okay, and then finally, yes, you go in and prepare an armed opposition, all right, and then you deploy your agents there, in logistics to support that, and then finally, there's this phase where you will do covert activity and indirect action, okay, that can be denied, that will cause actual conflict, violence to happen and occur, and then in the last two phases, in order to win the initial phase of the war, IPW, you're going to go in very rapidly with large-scale reconnaissance and attacks. And attacks won't look necessarily like lots of artilleries or rockets coming at you. The large-scale attack could be a really big cyber attack that takes out the transportation system and the banks in a particular country on a day and causes mass confusion for this critical period of time where then you can actually come in with forces. And that's how this was described, okay? Hybrid threats is just one, some of the noise that happens up here, okay? It's not Russian new generation warfare because they built this looking at how they assessed things we did in Afghanistan or Iraq and other countries. So, I'm going to end here. The point being is, there is an architecture and a framework the Russians use to conduct military. It's not emotive. It is tied back to strategy. And as we can understand it, then you can identify what you're seeing, okay, where you're seeing it, and maybe you'll know what comes next. And that's the part that we seem to be missing from our analysis that we need to pay attention to. That's the end of my talk. Thank you.
My question is there anything in the literature about NATO encirclement that factors in the physical deployment of troops and military presence around Russia? Because if you look at the swapping of the massive removal of the U.S. military presence in Europe and its replacement by relatively weak neighboring military forces, there's actually been a reduction in the physical presence, the physical military threat to Russia. Do they ever discuss this issue, or is this a sort of a forbidden issue?
No, because it's, as you say, it's an information it's in their advantage to not say that. It would be, in fact, it would be in NATO's advantage to probably present that idea, so that they would have to counter it. But one of the big problems with NATO is their own pursuit of counter information operations, for which that should be a part, but is not. So no, they don't, because it would be to their disadvantage to do so, and that's part of this.
A question for both panelists, since you both mentioned great power status. Do you see an understanding by the Russians that great power status involves not just privileges and perquisites, but also responsibilities in their behavior in the international community?
Yeah, absolutely. There is a so I do international politics, and I'm very interested in learning more about international relations theory as it is being developed in Russia. And what I see is that academic discourse and foreign policy discourse are very, very tightly intertwined. As a matter of fact, Russian social sciences are still very ideologized, very politicized, so they reflect the dominant perspectives of the Russian government. But what I'm trying to say here is that in the Russian academia, there is a very active discussion of global leadership. So the problem of great power status has been translated into the discussion of responsible global leadership. And this discussion is framed in such a way as to present what the United States has done in a kind of very negative, pejorative light, and link Russia's almost like it's predestined to be a global leader due to its history, to its active involvement in regional global politics, its interest in contributing to global politics, its contribution to maintaining the role of international organizations and international law, with the caveat that Russia defines international law very narrowly as, the principles of non-intervention, the principles of sovereignty, as well as very narrow view of international organizations as U.S. Security Council, et cetera, et cetera. So yes,
they do talk about responsibilities of being a global leader, a great power.
My only addition to that is that there was an article this last week by Kartopolov, and he's talking about Russia's trying to develop the idea of providing security, alternative security for countries around the world as one of its main products. He said, but even he concludes, but we're really better at just selling tanks. So there's the notion that they want to get good at it. I mean,
okay, my question is primarily for Dr. Omar-Lecheva, but I'd love to hear your opinion too, Colonel. And correct me if I got this wrong, but if Russia is fighting a civilizational battle, I heard a lot of like Samuel Huntington. I feel like, and just as radical Islam could be said to be fighting a civilizational battle against the West. In countering that, as Westerners or as Americans, would we be best served to define our own culture and counter with our own civilizational war, or does that do a disservice to us?
Yeah, it does sound very much Huntington-like, although the Russian geopoliticians claim that the roots of Russian geopolitics go, precede Huntington's writings, go to Russian Eurasianists, and so on and so forth. And interestingly, Russia precisely criticizes the United States for forsaking its own civilization, its own traditional values, and it also criticizes Europeans for doing the same, and it's trying to appeal to kind of far right in Europe that has been on the rise, and in many European countries you can actually find a lot of support of Putin, but precisely because he is appealing to those conservative values, honor, family, Orthodox religion, or just religious values, and has been portraying the European leaders as sort of the pawns of the United States. So I don't want to say that the United States should engage in this kind of civilizational war, although some of the discourse that the Obama administration or the predecessor administration has been engaged in sounds very much like civilizational. We have us, we have them, we have rock states, we have the democratic community, etc. So I mean, there is already many similarities between civilizational thinking and the American discourse. But I would of course make a recommendation that you counter Russia's civilizational fear-mongering and
right. And same thing. It's not to our advantage to do it. I don't know why we would. It only gives them more. There's more fodder for the development of the first two phases of what they call new generational warfare. The idea to manipulate, use information sphere to shape whatever you're doing, good or bad, to that perspective where you're seen as attacking them. So we don't need to do it. On the other hand, I think America has done well in contemporary times, since the turn of the century, last century, because it kind of, we are what we are, and other people recognize it. So if we have sort of a global confidence, if that was inserted into our process, it's very subjective, I realize. That itself is a better tool than considering whether the advantages or disadvantages of putting a NATO headquarters in Estonia and the ramifications of that, or having yet another program on democracy going to this country and help convert the governments. I mean, those are the tactical pieces. The strategic pieces is we're pretty confident about who we are. We should maintain that, and that will carry more weight.
Let me just add one more thing. I think the only way to counter Russian civilizational discourse is by decreasing the number of people with which this discourse resonates. Right now, sanctions are actually playing in Russia's government's hands in that they create the conditions, tough economic times, growing fear of the immigrants, competition for jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So, and those sanctions exacerbated all of these fears and insecurities. But these are the kinds of conditions that make Russian people buy into this and kind of cheering traditional values, et cetera, et cetera. So, again, food for thought. This is in one way in which the sanctions hurt Russia, but they play in the hands of the Russian government.
Dr. Kip?
Tom, I was very pleased to hear you introduce the notion of generations. The Russians take this construct on warfare very seriously. And when Vladimir Shevchenko came up with a sixth generation of warfare, he had the one preceding it, something called thermonuclear war. Now, as far as I know, those arsenals still exist. We've reduced them, but there's a whole wide range of questions that now exist of exactly when they become engaged and how they become engaged, particularly when you begin to bring in the information factor in the conduct of new generation warfare. Because what you're talking about is a highly dynamic kind of conflict, relatively low density of forces, and if something goes wrong for either side, a fairly rapid situation of catastrophe, and then political leaders looking at now what do we do? And the mechanisms for managing the particular parts of the arsenal, whether they're cyber, whether they're nuclear, or whether they're other weapons of other generations. We haven't talked about energy weapons, etc., all of them being part of where things go. And yet, future war, which is what we're talking about, not just where we're fighting now, but where it will go, there don't seem to be any really effective instruments for managing conflict. I can remember the old NATO days when the notion was, well, we'll go nuclear and we'll signal. And we know for a fact that the Russians on the other side didn't even talk about signaling with a nuclear arsenal. Where are we now in terms of this, and particularly its relationship to other parts of the arsenal on both sides?
Yes, sir. So, there are two thoughts that I have. To answer that last question first, I don't know. Only that, in particular, if you look up here, the nuclear seems to be decoupled in their writing for how they see new generation of warfare. But you got to go back to what I'm trying to put back into the conversation is that's really an analysis of what they see us doing, this perpetual war they've gotten into. So somehow, at least initially, they're signaling that, as it used to be, when after mutual assured destruction, so 60s, 70s, the theory that nukes are really something different. They're political. They can be used, like we heard. I forgot when this was last year with the nuclear torpedo. We're testing a torpedo that can have a nuke on it, sort of a thing, as if it was something new. Because why? Because it has an information effect. Okay, it's something that then causes people to fear. If in the future you saw a lot of nuclear or a lot of Russian writings, and I haven't seen them yet, talking from the general staff about using TAC nukes in the case of a U.S. invasion. We're starting to see the writings saying NATO will invade. Those writings have started to appear. They almost look like Tom Clancy things, which is very un-Russian-like, actually, talking about they will come across the border. They are going to attack the motherland. If once we start seeing the writings that say, and they will use nukes, and they enter the idea of nukes, and then our writers will start writing about nukes, and we'll get into the nuclear, revise, dig up nuclear theory from before, dust it off. The first will be used to create fear. Then I don't know. So I don't know about that. But it gets back to the last thing I wanted to say, though, is this idea that on our side, we are running quickly to the emotive instead of pausing to look at the structural. And the Russians work off the structure. It's the one thing we have going for us in this, and we're ignoring it. And nukes create the existential threat, which only heighten the emotion. So I think, in some, haven't seen it yet very much. When we see it, it'll first be used as an I/O feature to create fear, create a conversation about something that may or may not happen, raise something to an existential level that is not necessarily there, okay, to see what else you can get out of it, if you're using Russian thinking. And then finally, it keeps us in an emotive track from paying attention to the structure from which we can actually anticipate. The only other note is we had a lot of other lines open to the Russians. It's interesting. It's almost, I think we have less dialogue and lines open to Russians now than when I was, studying under you and they were Soviets. In the late 80s, we had, I was running around the university in the Soviet Union as an Army captain. Couldn't do that now at all, I don't think, maybe. But anyway, so those sort of structural things need to be put back in place to even start having these conversations.
I was just thinking of the irony of the criticism Russia has piled on the United States about American exceptionalism when I hear the talk about the Russians now pairing geopolitical concerns with civilizational perspectives with their foreign policy, and yet all the criticism that we have received as far as American exceptionalism, and now the Russians seem to be doing just exactly the same thing in doing this with their foreign policy. So any comments on that? And I was also curious what role the Russian Orthodox Church has had in the evolution of this civilizational perspective pairing with the national interest and geopolitical concerns.
Very briefly, Russia has been a copycat, has been mimicking lots of things that the United States have done. Like notion of soft power instruments. You have Freedom House in the West that is measuring the level of democracy in various states of the world. Russia set up a bunch of its own institutes in Paris, New York, London to measure democratic processes in those advanced democratic nations. So this is just some of the few examples that come to mind, but Russia has been emulating, has been learning, borrowing, resignifying, meaning that it takes a notion, a content, a process, sometimes gives a new spin, a new name, definitely a new meaning, so that it fits its interests, its contexts. But it has been borrowing a lot from the United States or from the West in general. And on the role of the Orthodox Church, it has played. It's not a secret. It's an arm of the government, or the government receives a lot of support from the church. The church has tried to broaden the notion of the Russian world as far as some parts of Kazakhstan, Moldova, etc. That the Russian government, the government of President Putin, banned or annulled the Soviet-era holiday of October Revolution that the Soviet Union and Russia celebrated diligently, religiously for 70 plus years. So it was celebrated on November 7th. Now there is a new holiday. It's called the Unity Day that is celebrated on November 4th. And it was all in this context of creating this new identity, national unity, civilizational identity, central to national unity, blah, blah, blah. But an interesting, so I did some research, and there is really nothing on about this day, and it's to denote or to celebrate, to honor the people's militia that liberated Moscow in 1612 from the occupation by the Lithuanian Polish Commonwealth. This is when it's the struggle that ended the periods of trouble in Russia, and then the following year, the new dynasty of Romanovs was established that ruled Russia for the next several years. Long story short, but why November 4th? There's nothing really that happened on the saints, and that was the holiday that was embraced and approved, endorsed, supported by the Orthodox Church. So yes, the Orthodox Church is an arm of the government, provides lots of support, and the government finds lots of support. It's a soft power tool that the government uses as well.
Yeah, as I said, I don't know if you want us to kind of have a few final words here, and then if there were any last questions for folks. But one thing I wanted to add, just in these final remarks, is as we're hearing these conversations today about Russia and its neighbors, sort of along NATO's border, so to speak, I'm glad actually in this last session we got to hear a bit of the Russian perspective. It was good because it's easy to sort of talk about the concerns and threats that Russia provides other states, but it's also good to see it from their perspective. And which reminds me, when we were talking about, in fact, one of Tom's slides on NATO enlargement, I recall during the 2003 Big Bang, it was late March, the center I was working at, Marshall Center, had a number of participants from, well, all of these countries, right, post-Soviet states and beyond. And the director at the time hosted a party for our seminar, for our course, and all the participants were there, and they got to cut the cake, which had a congratulations to the 7 new NATO countries. And in the sort of all these celebratory remarks, a comment was made to the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Kazakhs and the Uzbeks and the Azeris: if you work hard enough, you too might someday get into NATO. And from the Russians, quite frankly, they felt offended. They felt like second-class citizens, that they were, lesser people. And unfortunately, though, this kind of narrative, this hubris that we in the West exhibited, has, not to say created this, but has helped fuel and at least offered wonderful touch points for the Russian counter-narratives on NATO's threats and other things. And just kind of one other personal anecdote on this, and it sort of ties into the theme today on Russia's border. Now, I sort of give this one story, but it's important here. A couple years later, I take my family on a vacation up to Scandinavia. I was living in Germany, and of course, why not go to the Arctic? That's what you do. And you literally load them up in the car, and you drive. And we got all the way up to the Norwegian-Russian border. Varangerfjord is this sort of a nice little waterway between the two countries. And it was obviously really cool and interesting and all that good stuff, as one is prone to say up in the Arctic. And what was interesting is on both sides, you had all of these signs in 4 languages of what would happen to you if you went into the river, which was usually imminent death. You had a Norwegian or a NATO post on one side and a Russian, parentheses, pre-Soviet or post-Soviet, border post on the other side. But on this wonderful sunny August day, I saw this wonderful man fishing in the middle of the fjord. He's sort of in his waders, kind of doing his thing, and realizing it was completely safe. It was completely demilitarized. The border forces that were there, you'd have to look to find them. The few guys in the Norwegian post were, smoking cigarettes, and the few guys in the Russian post were smoking cigarettes and probably other things. But, everyone was just kind of pretty peaceful and mellow. Well, 12 years later, I think it's changed a bit, right? And what we see today when we started off talking about Ukraine, it's become a focal point. And in my remarks, I made a comment of, it is a war. And I think this is something we in the outside world have a hard time accepting, that what Ukraine is dealing with is a very difficult situation. We'd kind of like it to go away, but it's not. Ukraine has had to deal with throughout its history. I recall going back some of the articles in the 1990s coming out of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's reports would talk about the threats to Crimea, the threats to, if you want to say the Russian zones, the Donbass region. There was a flurry of activity trying to understand the multicultural, multinational post-Soviet states throughout that period. And I think, Andrei did a wonderful job in looking at this to sort of pro-West or maybe a pro-Russia, kind of a multi-foreign policy approach, how Ukraine has looked at a number of these approaches and clearly now is facing some challenges there. And from that, as we went through our panels, I sort of took out 3 big themes, and we'll just leave it at this. One, boy, conflict is complex, right? We're looking at a wide range of conflict models that aren't your traditional state-on-state efforts. They're really about different forms or different groups. And I know Tom, in this study, is, and I hope we get to see some of this in writing, or at least you keep talking about it, because it is important to rethink the Russian narrative on conflict. We can't superimpose our American views on it, which in D.C. that seems to be all we're doing. And so it's good to think in terms of how we're looking at it, but even how we're studying it. And through technologies that, quite frankly, did not exist in past years, we can now get a better first-hand account of what's going on. Secondly, the ability to understand the conflicts itself is dynamic. These narratives, this is probably a word that was used quite a bit today for important reasons. And whether we're looking at the narratives of citizens in Narva or we're looking at the Russian president and his interpretation, from the micro level to the macro level, how people interpret these conflicts and how they justify their role, their position, and really almost their micro histories is going to be critical. And thirdly, everyone appears to be threatened. My God, as I was listening today, it was pretty much every country is under siege. I mean, Ukraine is obviously, Estonia is, Iran, Syria, Russia too. In sort of a strange way, if we kind of look back, Russia almost feels the most threatened. I love the slide that Maria had up with sort of, great power and danger, because that's definitely the case. And maybe as we look through this, we need to understand that, in this second decade of the 21st century, several decades from the end of history, well, history hasn't ended. In fact, it's alive and well. We're still looking at countries that are struggling with the idea that they can be great powers, regional powers, some sort of influential powers, positive powers. Ultimately, they are looking at their interests. And I would say on a state level, national interests are playing a role. But perhaps equally important, and maybe increasingly more important today, we're seeing micro-level, community-level discussions becoming much, much more important in this region. It's not just geopolitical chess games, but it's multi-level efforts at lower levels that we're seeing play a big, big role. With that, I should say, I just wanted to close my remarks, and I don't know how we'd want to proceed, but I'll kind of make a quick conclusion is with all this conflict, and I can imagine that as we look at Russia along NATO's borders, we're seeing conflicts and challenges. Maybe if we start thinking in terms of optimistic approaches to cooperation, well, maybe that's for the next conference. We can all go back to fishing along Russia's border peacefully, but that'll be another time. So thank you. Okay.
Let me take this opportunity again to thank our guests and our audience and everyone involved in organizing this event. Please give yourselves a round of applause. We really deserve it. Enjoy the beautiful weather outside.